One thing in the interview that you mentioned that really blew my mind was that, you made this connection between LLMs having no actual grounding in the world to meaning, which is, it's the traditional way we think about
Yeah.
language, that meaning is grounded in something. And then, saying that it's really just doing this autoregression where the snake eating its own tail is a great
Exactly.
kind of an image for that. But that, rather that meaning comes from not grounding, but this like sort of shape of the web of, relationships between other words. So you mentioned this like this high dimensional latent space of sorts. It sort of made me think about this. It kind of like music, right? So, one note by itself, it doesn't mean anything. It has no
Bingo.
meaning. But then it's, as it moves along through the song, meaning kind of emerges through these relationships. And, the shape of the sonic structure of music, it has all these, built-in shapes that we don't typically think of. But, as you are a musician, you learn about music, you get these intuitive senses of how notes come to fit together and things like that. Are you saying that language is perhaps something like this?
That is so apt. I can't begin to tell you. And I actually have a piece that I've been meaning to polish off, talking about exactly that. Music is, in some ways, a much more direct and intuitive form of exactly this.
Hmm.
That, like you said, notes really don't mean anything. And if you have perfect pitch, you can name it a note. But a note is really only meaningful in relation to the other notes. That's what it is. That's what. And as far as music is concerned, a note is really just its connection, and you can transpose up or down or whatever, and you have the same exact melody, right? It's the same melody. Just what do you mean in C minor? What does that mean, right? Well, because it's only about the actual relational structure. It's not a different song. It's the exact same song. It's the exact same melody. Even if it's in, if the keys are all different. And so music is actually this remarkably pure form of pure relational encoding. Um, I think there's some deep clues to the structure of the mind from music. People have long suspected this, and people have looked at music. It's very mysterious what on earth it is and why we love it so much and why it does what it does inside of us.
Totally.
Um, and I think there's a deep clue in the autoregressive framework because it is this thing exactly. It's this relational structure that plays out over time where there's this prediction, right? One of the key aspects of music is that it has this catchiness to it. It's easily remembered, and there's a certain predictive quality to it, right? It's not just all over the map. If you're a musician in particular, if I give you a few bars of a melody, you might be able to continue that melody in a way that either is exactly right or makes sense, whatever that means, right? Well, what's that sense? It's because we've learned this kind of trajectory through through the notes that there's certain trajectories that make sense. And it's just like language. There's certain trajectories that make sense. Certain words come after other words. And it's that relational structure that we end up learning when we learn how to speak and when we learn how to talk, when we learn how to understand. And so I think music is a very, very apt example. It's not even a metaphor. It's sort of the same fundamental principles, but in a very different domain. Music is a more pure form of it.
Hmm.
In language, and you talked about meaning, and I just want to quickly mention this. Language, and people often object, well, what do you mean? Words, they have meaning. They talk about things in the world, and that is true but in a very indirect sense. That's sort of the very subtle point here that's a little hard to get across. The large language models just learn certain relations. To them, it's just like music, literally just like music. They just learn the pure inherent relational structure. The same way you can't tell me what's a melody about, or it make you feel a certain way, but it doesn't carry meaning outside of itself. To the large language models, that's what all of language is. It's just a relational structure.
Hmm.
To us, there is also this other stuff going on. When I'm talking to you, when I say there's a certain object with certain properties, there are other things happening elsewhere in your brain. You might have imagery. You might have motor kind of processes. These are in concert with, they're coordinated with the linguistic system, and so there is extension to language. Language does other stuff inside your body, may make you later on reach for a certain object. In some mysterious way, this all does actually, like if I tell you something, it does have behavioral implications. And vice versa, when you see something or you hear, somebody or whatever, you experience something, this has linguistic implications, but it's still ungrounded. in the sense that, and this is the claim is it's still really operating entirely based on the same principles as the large language models. It's just music, but that music also makes people dance or it makes people feel certain things, right? But the music itself has its own rules. And so that's why it's just a great metaphor. Again, not even a metaphor.
Yeah.
Oh, go on. The music is really kind of like it's the pure example of a quote unquote meaningless structure for its own sake. I think language is the same thing. It's ungrounded in that sense that it operates based on its own rules, but it also has this kind of after effects, these auxiliary effects that give it its real utility.
That makes so much sense too in light of, as SLPs, we work with kids and we see a lot of the language development process happening. And you could see how kids they sort of feel into the meaning of words before they
Feel
have a
into.
direct, like, idea of what
Well,
they
and they
actually,
never, but that's the thing, and you say that, but we never end up with the idea, right? And
right,
that's the myth.
right.
And exactly right. It's like the feeling into it. It's like they're learning how to operate within this physical and linguistic realm where this stuff happens together, but they're not actually learning definitions of words, and definitions end up failing miserably. And if we're thinking about teaching in terms of definitions, we're thinking about it wrong. And I think that's your deep intuition. I think that's why you reached out to me,
Yeah.
because that is not actually like that's the way we think about teaching. It's like shove sort of more words or something into it. But instead, what you're really doing is you're learning how to operate behaviorally in this sensory linguistic sphere where both of these things are kind of interacting, but they're not the same thing. The words they have their shape, and then the perceptual has its own shape, and then we learn how to coordinate within both of them.
I've had this kind of intuition for a long time that, no matter how many, you have a dictionary, like the classic, idea is that you have a word and then the dictionary has a list of definitions. But I've
Yes.
just felt, if you actually examine language as we have to do, we have to listen to a lot of language samples of kids, you realize that there's just not an apt characterization of a word at all is to have a list of definitions. There's like way both more possibility and also less possibility in some ways because it can only go in certain shapes, like you're saying. Like these words have like these particular relationships, and also, context really is everything,
That's
like in that.
context. Exactly. Exactly. The behavior, like you mean the context, like not, you don't just mean like linguistic context. You
Yeah.
mean like the environmental context. Like you're sitting in a room and you're like, can you get that for me? Right? Those words in and of itself, what on earth, that doesn't mean anything if you don't have all the other stuff. Right? And then you realize, well, no, those words don't really mean what we think they mean. Can you get that for me? Does that have a definition, right? Is those words going to map to anything meaningful independent of the particular context? So it's
Right.
exactly. I think that's you've clearly intuited. I think as a clinician, the strong limitations of sort of the classical way of thinking about language, and I don't know to what extent that it's helping you to formulate interventions, but I'm dying to hear about that, honestly.
Well, I think for probably most clinicians now, at least the ones I work with, the traditional, like you teach this card and then, they learn that apple, that like this picture of an apple is an apple. It just doesn't really work because sometimes you can teach a kid, um, it's so funny. Like I've had so many times, especially with language testing, you have to test a definition of a word and a child can't give you the definition of the word. Like they seemingly don't know what it means. And then just 5 seconds later, they're using that word in a different
Right.
context,
Right.
correctly. It's so funny. It really shows that this is not
Yeah.
how we're learning language.
Right. And it's kind of almost not how we're learning anything. And it really gets to this sort of this implicitness of cognition itself, is that it's just kind of running. Let's just focus on the case of language. When I'm producing words, or when a large language model is producing words, it's doing it in purely in this sort of this generative sense where the previous sequence is predicting the next word. There isn't any cognizance in the model at all of what the intent of any of those words are. It's just using the available information to generate. The prediction is implicit, it's inherent. Here's another way to put it. And I talk about this in relation to knowledge. When I ask you, where are you from, or what did you do yesterday? There's this notion that what we're doing is we've got stored memories that contain information. There's this sort of like in these buffers, these memory buffers that contain facts, and we go and we retrieve those facts. And that's how a classic database actually works. Right? If you SQL, if you do, if people do the kind of like database management, you literally have lists of facts, and then the trick is how do you retrieve the correct fact? That's not what happens at all in large language models. You'll ask them a question and they will give you the answer. And if you're lucky, in most cases, the answer will be correct. But that fact wasn't stored anywhere. This fact wasn't actually in there because the fact, like I say to a model, what is autoregression, right? And then it might give me a nice long sequence of words that you can't find that sequence anywhere in the model. It doesn't exist because as you recall, it's just doing next token. It's just doing very one, and then it just does it over and over again. So what it really has is the potential, given the right input, it's going to produce this output, and then you run it, and it ultimately will produce this meaningful set of outputs. So what that means is that the model doesn't really know what autoregression is. And it's kind of weird to think about, right? And well, sure it does. It's responding appropriately. But if you were to look in the guts of this thing, if you were to able to decode all of the weights in this model, you're not going to find a definition of autoregression. It's not in there. The definition is not in there. And what you did, my claim is what you, Garrett, when I ask you, what did you do yesterday? You'll be able to tell me that answer. But if I were to, actually, shake your brain and peer at it with the greatest, kind of imaging technology, the answer is not actually in there. How does the answer emerge? It emerges because implicit in the structure of your brain is the ability to produce this kind of behavior. And so it's a it's sort of subtle, but it's a foundational difference, right? The knowledge isn't in there. The knowledge, your brain gets shaped over time to produce certain kinds of behaviors, and that can be a linguistic behavior, like telling me what some fact, or it can be a behavior like doing something, knowing how to do a procedure, or appropriately responding to somebody's request. All of these kinds of things.